The moment Mason Kincaid told me my position was sunset effective immediately, something inside me went perfectly still. He thought it was a clean cut, a cost-saving triumph, a painless way to remove the woman who built the very engine his empire ran on. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to learn, was that some systems don't collapse when you fire their creator. They go quiet, they wait, and then they take everything back. If you've ever been blindsided at work, tell me in the comments. And stay with me. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. For 8 years, I kept that Atlanta office running in ways most people never even realized. While everyone else focused on flashy presentations and quarterly slogans about innovation, I was the one shaping the flow of freight across 13 states, smoothing inventory surges, predicting bottlenecks before they even had names. The FlowGrid engine wasn't just a system to me, it was a living thing I'd built piece by piece, quietly, steadily, without the need for credit. Maybe that's why no one questioned it when leadership started rewriting how the company talked about success. They erased the history of how we got here with the same ease they erased the old CEO's family photos from the lobby wall. Mason Kincaid arrived like a man auditioning for a role he already thought he owned. He spoke in these hollow phrases about streamlined futures and strategic reduction of legacy inefficiencies, and people nodded even though half of us didn't understand what he was trimming or why. What we did understand was the change in the air, a heaviness, a new habit of glancing over shoulders, a sense that the wrong question could quietly end a career. The first week he walked through our department, he didn't ask a single thing about FlowGrid or its architecture. He just scanned the room like someone shopping for things he might return. His protege, a 24-year-old innovation consultant who barely knew how to read a routing delay report, hovered behind him, smirking like the mere act of standing beside Mason made him important. I wish I could say I didn't notice the shift in my own meetings, but it was impossible to ignore. Architecture sessions I'd led for years were suddenly reassigned. Invitations disappeared from my calendar without explanation. One morning, I found the protege sitting in on a system review, asking me to simplify the technical jargon because he wanted to feel connected to the workflow. He wasn't listening, he wasn't learning. He was preparing to replace me without understanding what I did. People around me grew quieter too. Colleagues who used to stop by my desk for advice walked with their eyes down now, leaving exactly at 5. My manager, once warm, collaborative, became stiff, slipping into formal language even when we were alone. I recognized the tone because it's the one people use when they're preserving deniability, and yet, despite everything, I kept working. When a storm in North Carolina knocked out a warehouse node, I stabilized it before dawn. When a client escalated a late-night discrepancy, I chased down the corrupt data packet myself. Creating stability had become muscle memory, something I gave because the operation needed it, not because anyone thanked me for it. What stung most wasn't the workload, but the sense that the company no longer understood its own backbone. FlowGrid handled more than 70% of our freight coordination, but leadership talked about it like a plug-and-play module they could lift and drop wherever they wanted. One afternoon, while I adjusted a predictive load balancing script, I saw Mason standing outside the glass wall of the operations lab, studying the screens like he expected a hidden flaw to jump out and confess itself. He wore that same shallow half smile he saved for investor calls, the one that never reached his eyes. Something about the look told me he'd already made a decision. Not based on knowledge, not based on need, based on ego. FlowGrid was invisible to him because I was invisible to him, and people in power destroy the things they don't see until the day those things stop carrying them. The message arrived at 4:07 p.m., just a blank calendar invite titled Meeting Mason Kincaid, and the moment I saw it, something in my chest tightened, not out of fear but out of recognition. People like Mason did not call private meetings to offer praise. They called them to deliver decisions they'd already rehearsed. Still, I walked down the hallway with my notebook in hand because showing up prepared was the only way I knew how to move through the world. His office sat on the 23rd floor, walled with glass so bright it stripped the warmth from every color inside it. Mason didn't stand when I entered. He didn't even look up right away. He finished whatever he was typing, then leaned back with the calculated ease of someone who believed the room belonged to him. "Adriana, thanks for coming," he said, gesturing toward the chair like he was offering me a seat on a train already leaving the station. I sat, placing my notebook on my lap, waiting. "I'll be direct," he said, folding his hands. "Your position has been sunset as part of our operational realignment." The words hit with a coldness so clean it almost felt rehearsed. Sunset, as if my entire career were nothing more than a marketing campaign reaching its expiration date. I kept my voice steady. "Effective when?" His smile sharpened just enough to reveal the satisfaction underneath. "Immediately," he said. "HR is processing the exit documentation. Security will escort you so the transition remains smooth." He paused, then added with a dismissive flick of his hand. "And of course, everything you've built here, FlowGrid's architecture, optimization models, all associated, documentation, will remain company property. Our team will take over from here." There it was, not just the dismissal, but the theft disguised as entitlement. My phone, tucked inside my blazer pocket, recorded every word. I didn't trust leadership anymore, and clearly with reason. I held his gaze without flinching, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to mistake it for acceptance. He broke it first, already shifting his attention back to his computer. "Thank you for your service," he said, tone flat and transactional, like he was unsubscribing from a monthly subscription he'd grown tired of. He didn't dismiss me. He simply stopped acknowledging I was in the room, which I suppose was its own kind of dismissal. I stood, picked up my notebook, and walked out. The hallway felt longer than usual, each step echoing the truth settling into place. Mason had never understood what I built. He never tried. He wanted control, not comprehension. When I reached my desk, nothing looked different. My ceramic mug still sat beside the monitor, my soft glow lamp still lit the corner, and the printed diagram of FlowGrid's early design still hung exactly where I'd pinned it years ago. But I knew this was the last time I would see these things together in one space. I pulled a cardboard box from under the desk and began packing. Not in anger, not in panic, just with a quiet precision that felt almost ceremonial. A small thank you note from a warehouse manager, a worn stress ball shaped like a cargo crate, my favorite pen, a folder of scribbled ideas I never shared because I knew leadership wouldn't appreciate them. Each item slid into the box like a final reminder that I had given this place everything I had, and they had given me nothing but assumptions in return. When security arrived, it wasn't some stranger. It was Gerald, a man I'd known since my second month at the company. His eyes softened when he saw the box. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded, lifting it into my arms. The walk through the office was a parade of sudden distractions. Co-workers who avoided eye contact, screens that flickered with company values that suddenly read like cruel jokes, integrity, respect, innovation. No one said goodbye. No one wanted to be seen standing too close to someone being erased. Outside, the heat of early evening wrapped around me like a world I had forgotten existed. Gerald held the door and murmured, "This wasn't right, Adriana." "I know," I said, forcing a small smile. But as I walked to my car, humiliation burned under my skin, not because I had been fired, but because Mason genuinely believed he could claim my life's work with a single sentence. He didn't realize that some endings are detonators, and he had just pressed one without reading the label. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I pulled into the back lot of a quiet cafe, the kind where strangers sat under warm lighting and talked about ordinary days, birthdays, errands, weekend plans. Their world looked soft, untouched by the kind of blow I'd just taken, but my hands were steady, almost unnervingly so. Humiliation tends to shake people. What I felt instead was a narrowing, a kind of precision that pushed everything else to the edges. I unlocked my phone and called Lena, my attorney. She answered on the second ring as if she'd been expecting it. "Tell me," she said. "He fired me," I said, effective immediately. The paper sounds on her end stopped. "And did he claim the system was company property?" "Every line of it," I said, the memory of his voice scraping fresh irritation across my chest. He said their team will take it over. Lena exhaled through her teeth, the sound of someone witnessing exactly the mistake they'd warned their client about. Then he just detonated his own operation. I frowned, staring at the glowing windows of the cafe. Explain. Do you remember the licensing structure we negotiated when you rebuilt FlowGrid? Of course I remembered the conversation, even if at the time it felt more like a formality than a weapon. The company had been desperate then. Warehouses glitching, shipments delayed, clients impatient. They needed a system overhaul, and they didn't have the leverage to demand full ownership of my pre-existing frameworks. I agreed to architect FlowGrid for them, but only under a very specific condition. Anything I'd created before my employment remained mine. They received a license, not ownership. And that license had terms. The continuity-dependent licensing clause, Lena said now, her voice sharpening with purpose. They lose all rights to operate FlowGrid the minute they terminate your employment. No transition period, no exceptions. The realization clicked into place like a gear catching at high speed. So right now, she confirmed, they no longer have legal permission to run the system that supports most of their regional freight network. I leaned back in my seat, watching a woman inside the cafe laugh at something her coworker said. Ordinary life in motion, completely unaware that a logistics firm across town was sitting on a time bomb. Do they even know? I asked. Old leadership understood, Lena said. Legal understood. But Mason? The people he brought in? She let out a small, dark laugh. They were too busy trying to impress him to read what they were supposed to present to him. A strange calm settled into me then, heavier but steadier than anything I'd felt in months. What happens next? We wait, she said. Do not answer any calls from them tonight. The CFO will notice discrepancies by morning. Once they realize they don't have rights to the system, panic will follow. The word lingered. Panic, not mine, but theirs. I opened my laptop right there in the car and logged into FlowGrid's admin dashboard. Every credential worked. Every access point remained under my control. Mason hadn't even thought to remove me yet. Data streams flowed across the screen. Warehouse loads, interstate routing updates, predictive adjustments, still running, still stable, still mine, legally mine. Not because I sabotaged anything, not because I altered a single line, but because Mason fired me without understanding the structure of the house he tried to steal. Some systems collapse when you remove their architect. Others simply revert to her, and FlowGrid had just come back home. I woke the next morning before the sun even touched the skyline, not because anxiety shook me awake, but because a strange, steady clarity had taken root overnight. My phone was already buzzing by the time I poured my first cup of coffee. Unfamiliar extensions, office lines, numbers I'd only ever seen in internal memos. I let every call ring out. Lena's instructions were simple. Silence wasn't avoidance, it was strategy. And strategy right now was the only language the company understood. By 8:30 a.m., the pattern changed. HR called twice, then IT, then Mason, though he didn't leave a voicemail. Cowards rarely want their panic recorded. I sat at my kitchen table, stirring cream into my coffee as if nothing extraordinary were happening. Because in truth, nothing was. The extraordinary part had already happened the moment Mason pulled the trigger on my employment contract without reading the clause wrapped inside it. At 9:04 a.m., a cluster of calls hit my phone at once. CFO line, legal line, Mason's direct number again. That meant only one thing. The emergency board meeting had begun. I could almost picture the room, the long glass wall overlooking Midtown, the hum of the projector, the icy quiet of executives trying not to show fear. My phone rang again at 9:17, then 9:19, then 9:22. Each call felt like a tremor reaching the surface from something cracking open beneath them. I didn't answer a single one. At 10:06, Lena finally called. I picked up instantly. Her voice came through in a low whisper, not from secrecy, but from the thrill of watching arrogance unravel in real time. "It's happening," she said. "How bad?" I asked. Bad enough that they're sweating through their suits. I set my mug down and listened as she walked me through the implosion. Mason opened the meeting with a slide deck about operational savings, she said. He actually bragged about eliminating your role. The absurdity made me laugh under my breath. Of course he had. And then Dana, the CFO, stopped him by slide 3. She asked him to explain how FlowGrid licensing worked. My heart thudded once, slow and heavy. He told the board it was standard intellectual property ownership, Lena continued. He said the company had full rights regardless of staffing changes. He lied, I murmured. No, Lena corrected. He guessed. He never bothered to read. Your contract. Legal stepped in and spelled out the continuity clause, out loud, in front of everyone. For a moment I imagined the look on Mason's face, the confidence draining, the realization spreading like frost across glass. He thought firing me would clean up a line item. He didn't understand he'd slice through the foundation. How did the board take it? I asked. 2 members started talking over each other. Dana demanded to know why she wasn't briefed. The CTO tried explaining FlowGrid's dependencies and ended up confessing he didn't understand half of it. She paused, savoring the next part. And then they projected loss models if FlowGrid goes offline. Millions in the first week, tens of millions by the first month. One of them used the word catastrophic. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the steam curling from my coffee. Not triumph, not vindication. Just the quiet confirmation of something I had known from the moment Mason fired me. Power doesn't always roar when it shifts. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's a phone that keeps ringing while you sip your coffee in peace. They want you to call them back, Lena said. They're desperate. Not yet, I said. Let them sit with it a little longer. Because the truth was simple. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard anymore. My silence was doing the work for me. By the second afternoon, the calls from the company shifted from persistent to frantic. Each new voicemail carried a sharper edge, the tone of people who finally realized the ground under them wasn't solid anymore. I didn't listen to most of them. I didn't need to. Panic has a sound even through the muted buzz of a phone screen. Instead, I turned my attention to something that had nothing to do with Mason or his collapsing kingdom, my future. Lena had told me to start exploring options, not out of spite, but because leverage means nothing unless you're willing to move. The first name that came to mind was Callum Reed, COO of Phoenix Freight Systems in Nashville. We'd crossed paths at logistics conferences over the years. He was one of the few executives who actually understood the mechanics behind the technology, not just the slide decks summarizing them. Phoenix had been trying to break into interstate freight optimization for a while but lacked the infrastructure to scale. FlowGrid in the right hands could change that. So I drafted a short email, nothing dramatic, just a clear message saying I was no longer with the company, that I held full ownership of my pre-existing system architecture, and that I was open to conversations about potential licensing partnerships. He called me within 40 minutes. "Tell me what happened," he said, not with gossip in his voice, but with calculation. "My position was eliminated," I said, "effective immediately, and because of the licensing terms, FlowGrid reverted to me the moment they let me go." Silence, not disbelief, strategy. Then he exhaled. "Adriana, do you understand what you have?" "I do. Phoenix wants to talk numbers, big numbers." The next hour became a cascade. Callum looped in his CFO, then their head engineer, then someone from their strategic development team. They weren't just interested, they were ready. They asked questions no one at my old company ever cared enough to ask. They wanted to understand design philosophy, load prediction logic, scalability across multi-state corridors. Not once did they speak down to me. Not once did they suggest replacing me with someone more aligned with leadership vision. While we talked, my phone lit up with more calls from Mason. I didn't answer until the negotiations with Phoenix ended for the day. His voicemail was a jumble of phrases: operational risk, mutual benefit, urgent request, each one delivered with the breathless desperation of a man watching his certainty unravel. I deleted it without replying, because the truth was beginning to settle into my bones. They didn't get to decide my worth anymore. That afternoon, Phoenix sent a preliminary offer, far better than anything my old company ever imagined offering. Licensing fees, annual renewal, performance incentives, even the possibility of leading a new systems division. It felt surreal, not because of the money, but because someone finally saw Flowgrid and me for what we were: essential. And as the sun set over the parking lot outside my window, my phone buzzed again with Mason's number. I let it ring. The world he built on arrogance was cracking open. Mine was just beginning. Monday arrived with a kind of stillness that didn't feel like calm. It felt like the air right before a storm breaks open. I woke early, opened my laptop, and reread the final licensing agreement Phoenix Freight had sent overnight. $1,400,000 annually. Performance escalators, equity, full ownership of Flowgrid retained by me. It wasn't just a contract. It was validation carved into legal stone. At 9 a.m. sharp, Phoenix released the press announcement. Their language was bold, strategic, and deliberate. A multi-year partnership built on Flowgrid's architecture, a transformative step in national freight optimization, and my name in the first paragraph as the technical architect behind it all. I sat at my desk and watched the story spread across industry feeds, first logistics newsletters, then trade forums, then even mainstream finance pages. A few engineers I'd never met sent connection requests with messages like, "I've studied your work for years. I can't believe you're the one behind Flowgrid." Praise didn't usually affect me, but this time it landed in a place I'd forgotten existed. By noon, Phoenix's stock had jumped nearly 9%. Investors smelled momentum, opportunity, stability backed by architecture that had already survived real-world stress tests. Meanwhile, across Atlanta, the opposite was happening. My old company's stock began sliding the moment analysts connected the dots. The architect who designed their core routing engine had partnered with a rival, and the system running their warehouses and interstate flows was no longer legally theirs. For months, investors had been uneasy about Mason's aggressive restructuring. Now they had proof he'd been operating with less competence than ego. A few industry analysts even used the same phrase to describe their situation: unrecoverable oversight. Around early afternoon, I walked into Phoenix Freight headquarters for the first time. The building didn't have the sterile, pretentious shine of Mason's tower. It felt lived in, purposeful. Engineers moved through the hallways with notebooks, not buzzwords. When I met Callum and the team in a glass-walled strategy room overlooking Nashville's skyline, they greeted me like someone they were genuinely excited to build with. No pretense, no performance, just competence. It was almost disorienting to be treated with respect so openly. We spent hours reviewing integration steps: how to deploy Flowgrid 2.0, how to scale predictive routing into states they'd never serviced before, how to build a team around architecture instead of politics. Every question they asked was thoughtful. Every decision was made with clarity, not ego. And every moment reminded me I'd been surviving, not thriving, in my old job. During a break, my phone buzzed again. Mason. I didn't answer, but out of curiosity, I pressed play on the voicemail. His voice was barely recognizable, tight, shaky, stripped of that executive confidence he wore like armor. "Adriana, sub, please call me back. We're facing significant disruptions, and the board is demanding answers. We need to resolve this. Please." I deleted the voicemail. If Mason wanted stability, he should have protected the person who built it. As the day wrapped, Callum walked me to the elevator. "By the way," he said with a grin, "analysts are already asking how we secured Flowgrid. They're calling it a market-shifting move." I nodded, but inside something softer unfurled. Pride, relief, a sense that I'd stepped into a room where my story didn't end, but widened. When I left Phoenix headquarters, Nashville dusk glowing across the buildings, I realized something. The climax wasn't Mason's downfall. It was this moment, stepping fully into a future he had been too blind to imagine for me. Weeks passed before the dust fully settled, though by then the outcome was already written. Phoenix scaled FlowGrid 2.0 faster than even I predicted, and every milestone we hit sent ripples through the industry. Meanwhile, my old company kept hemorrhaging clients, credibility, and finally leadership. Mason resigned under the polite phrasing of board-requested transition, but everyone in the field knew what it really meant. His downfall wasn't caused by sabotage, but by his own arrogance meeting the wall of a contract he never bothered to understand. I didn't celebrate when I heard the news. The satisfaction wasn't in watching him fall. It was in knowing I no longer carried the weight of trying to prove my worth to someone who never valued it. Power didn't come from his collapse. It came from stepping into a space where my work could breathe without being stolen or diminished. One afternoon, as I stood overlooking Phoenix's operations floor, I watched a new team of engineers run simulations on routing models I once sketched in the margins of a notebook. They treated my ideas with a level of care I'd never experienced, asking questions that sharpened the design rather than undermine it. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for a fight. I wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. I was expanding into my own space. And that, more than any contract or clause, felt like victory. People in the comments often ask what moment changed me most, what flipped the balance from humiliation to power. It wasn't the firing, it wasn't the boardroom panic, it wasn't even the press release that carried my name farther than Mason ever allowed. It was the quiet realization that my silence, my preparation, my patience, qualities people love to underestimate, were the very things that protected me when everything collapsed. Quiet strength is still strength. Sometimes it's the only kind that survives when louder forces burn themselves out. So here's what I hope someone out there hears. Document what matters. Protect the things you build. Don't let anyone convince you that being unnoticed means being powerless. And if you've ever been pushed aside by someone who thought they could take what you created, tell me in the comments. I promise you're not alone. Your story isn't over. It might just be starting. There's something unsettling about realizing the quiet work you poured years into, the late nights, the weekends traded, the careful decisions no one ever saw, can be dismissed in a single sentence by someone who never understood any of it. When Mason fired me, it wasn't just a job ending. It was the confirmation that leaders who talk the loudest often listen the least, and that arrogance at the top can rot an entire company from the inside out. I felt that rot long before the firing. I saw it in the way they replaced understanding with buzzwords, in the way a 24-year-old consultant could stroll into meetings and be treated like authority, while the people who built the foundation were treated like clutter. It stung more than I expected, not because I needed recognition, but because I knew where this kind of leadership always leads, to broken systems, broken trust, and broken people. And what struck me most wasn't the drama of the boardroom or the collapse that followed. It was how preventable it all was. If someone, anyone, had valued competence over ego, none of this would have happened. But culture starts at the top, and when the tone is careless, everything beneath it starts to fray. So when people ask me, how did they let this happen? I have a simple answer. They chose speed over sense, image over substance, authority over understanding. And once you choose that path, disaster isn't a question. It's a schedule. If you're watching this and recognizing some part of your own workplace, hear me. The problem isn't you. Sometimes the system really is broken. How to get started today. Pay attention to leadership patterns, not just their promises. Protect your boundaries before someone else redraws them. Document decisions when leadership feels unstable. Don't confuse chaos for opportunity. Notice when respect leaves the room and don't stay long after it does. What warning signs have you seen in your own workplace?